Greetings, class, and welcome to our new unit on protists, fungi, and plants. In this particular unit, we're actually going to be concentrating on protists and fungi for our test, and then studying plants separately, and we'll take a quiz on that a little bit later. Let's get started. The first group of organisms we're going to look at are the protists. The protists are a very unique kingdom. In fact, they may not even be a kingdom much longer. As scientists are learning so much about protists, there's been kind of a movement in biology lately in systematics of actually maybe breaking up the kingdom into several different kingdoms, kind of like they did the monorans a few years back into our different groups of bacteria that we studied in the previous unit. The kingdom is just so diverse, some of the organisms just don't really fit together. That's why they call it the junk drawer kingdom. It's that place like in your kitchen where your parents put all the stuff they don't know where else to put it. That's kind of what biologists do today with the protist kingdom. It's kind of the place where they dump stuff where they just don't really know where to put it, or it doesn't fit neatly anywhere else. But there are some characteristics that protists share in common, so let's kind of emphasize those first. First of all, protists are eukaryotic, which remember means, of course, they have a nucleus. They like to live in moist environments. The vast majority are unicellular, but some can be multicellular and live in colonies. Currently, the primary method of dividing up protists within the kingdom are into groups, kind of like by the way they acquire their food or the characteristics that they have, which are similar to other kingdoms. We have animal-like protists, plant-like protists, and fungus-like protists. The problem with this is it creates what's called the protist dilemma. And the protist dilemma is the problem that we have with the protist kingdom, in that these organisms share a lot of characteristics, more in common, in fact, with organisms of other kingdoms than they do with each other in their own kingdom. And then you have other organisms within the protist kingdom that scientists discover every day that have overlapping characteristics, like, for example, the Euglena, which can sometimes be autotrophic, but sometimes be heterotrophic. So I wouldn't be surprised within our lifetimes that there'll be a tremendous revision to the protist kingdom. But right now, this is kind of what we're stuck with, these three main groups here, and that's kind of how we'll move forward. However, in the readings, in chapter 21, you'll see that the discussion more about how scientists are looking to reorganize this kingdom moving down the line. So let's start looking at the protists by the primary method of division that we just mentioned in the previous slide, and that's basically into animal-like, plant-like, or fungus-like protists. Animal-like protists are known as protozoans. That's the term that describes them. Remember, all protozoans are protists, but not all protists are protozoans. To be a protozoan, you have to be like an animal. You have to be heterotrophic. For the most part, move from place to place, although not necessarily all of them. And this particular group here is actually classified primarily by that method in which they do move. You have those protists that are using as a method of locomotion called the pseudopod. You have those that use cilia for locomotion, and then those that use a flagella. And then you have that fourth group of parasitic protists that really don't need to have any method of locomotion on their own. They hitch a ride off their host. So let's look at some of these organisms now, starting first with the amoeba. The amoeba is an example of a sarcodine, and it uses pseudopods or false feet. It's a combination of two words, pseudo and pod. These guys use the pseudopod not only to move around, but as a method of engulfing their food, because they can wrap the pseudopod around a food particle and then create a food vacuole, as you can see here, and then kind of pull that particle into the actual cell. Remember, that's called endocytosis, or more specifically, phagocytosis. The amoeba has a nucleus, as you can see, because it's a eukaryote. It also has a contractile vacuole, which you'll see in other protists, which is used to regulate the amount of water in the cell. Another example of an animal-like protist is the paramecium. The paramecium is an example of a ciliate, because it uses cilia to move around, just like the amoeba use the pseudopods to move around. The cilia are tiny little hairs that kind of beat in unison together, and they can help propel the paramecium forward. They can also help move food into the paramecium, into its oral groove, where a food vacuole will form around the particle. The paramecium is kind of unique. Not only does it have the contractile vacuole, but it actually has two nuclei, as you can see here, the large nucleus and the small nucleus, also known as the macronucleus and the micronucleus. The large nucleus is like the brain of the cell and primarily controls the day-to-day functions of the cell, whereas the small nucleus is more responsible for the genetic aspect, the reproductive part of the paramecium. They also have an anal pore to expel waste, and they have a unique structure called the pellicle, which surrounds the cell. In addition to animal-like protists, we also have plant-like protists. And these guys are plant-like because they're autotrophic and they are photosynthetic. You guys remember that, right? They can make their own food. This group collectively is known as algae, just as the animal-like protists are collectively known as protozoans. They can be unicellular, or they can live in colonies, multicellular, like, for example, kelp and seaweed. And they include all kinds of organisms, dinoflagellates, the different types of algae, the euglena, which we'll look at in a second, diatoms, spirogyra, some of the stuff that we looked at in the lab that we did together. But the primary thing they share in common with plants is the fact that they are autotrophic and photosynthetic. Great example of a plant-like protist is the euglena, which is kind of interesting. This is a great example that something can actually cross the line into both. It can be plant-like and it can also be animal-like sometimes if conditions are not favorable. This is an example of a flagellate, the third group. You can see it uses the flagella to get around. It also, I'm going to take that away there so you can see the other stuff. You can see the flagellum here. It also has some other unique characteristics in that it has the chloroplast for photosynthesis. It too has the pellicle, a contractile vacuole, and very cool here, an eye spot. What do you think that's for? It's not a true eye like ours. It can only detect changes in light. So it's good to help the euglena. Since it can move to areas where there's more light, which of course is better for photosynthesis. And the ability to move is also beneficial when they are heterotrophic. Fungus-like protists are, again, like fungus. They have a cell wall. They're heterotrophs like fungi. And they can move at least during some part of their lives. And they reproduce using spores like traditional fungi. And some examples include water molds, downy mildew, slime molds, that kind of stuff. Stuff you see in wet areas like around the shower basin and stuff like that, the locker room. So that concludes the protists. Let's take a little close look at another kingdom, which are the fungi. Don't forget to read sections 21.1, 21.2, and 21.3 for more related information to protists. Fungi, that information can be found in 21.4. Now, the fungi are another kingdom, which accidentally, once upon a time, were actually classified along with plants. Because, I mean, really, when you look at them, they look like plants. But they are different. They are eukaryotic like plants. They do have cell walls like plants, but they're actually heterotrophs. They cannot make their own food. And in fact, scientists have now found that the cell wall is actually different. It's made of a material called chitin, not the same material that a plant cell wall is made of. They have bodies composed of a structure called hypha, which are these tube-like structures you can see in this picture here, a series of tubes that can be used to move food and material from outside of the fungus into the main body of the fungus. And the main body of the fungus is composed of just tons of wrapped together hypha. That's called the mycelium. That's the primary body of the fungus, and most of the time you never see that. That's usually in the soil or in the dead and decaying organism that the fungus is decomposing. Fungi are called saprophytes, and they are decomposers, and they are very important as in nature's recyclers, recycling material and putting it back into the environment. They reproduce using spores, and you can see some examples of fruiting bodies here, these black dots here. These black dots actually contain dozens and dozens of spores each one. They're very, very tiny, and those spores will be released, and they'll land in areas if conditions are favorable, moist, warm, maybe a little bit dark. Those areas are very favorable for the growth of new fungi. When you see a traditional fungus, most of the time you're seeing this part here. That part is called the fruiting body. That's the reproductive structure. In the case of the mushroom here, that's the part we see. The rest of the mushroom we never really see. The mycelium we don't see. This is what we see, which contains the spores underneath on those gill-like structures. You bang into that or kick it, and those spores will be released. Now, in the fungi kingdom, you can actually have two methods of reproduction. You can find some that reproduce asexually, like the yeast, for example, which forms a bud, which is a small version of the parent cell. You can see it right here. That will turn out to be an identical form of the parent cell later. Or some reproduce sexually by growing their hyphae together. And when they grow their hyphae together, they'll create a new fruiting body, which has genetically different spores than the parents. And that's an example down here. You can see the hypha growing together. and the genetically different spores being released later. Now, fungi are traditionally broken up by the type of fruiting body they produce. Some produce fruiting body that is kind of akin to a sac, like for example the yeast, like a little bag or something. Some produce a club-like structure, like for example the mushroom. And then you have the thread-like fungi, or what are called the zygote fungi, which produce a fruiting body that looks like this, or this is called a sporangium here, which is thin and fibrous. Now, the role of fungi is very significant, and oftentimes we don't think too much about them, but they are a great source of food. I'm sure people enjoy eating mushrooms, they enjoy eating bread and pizza, which has yeast in it. They're also environmental recyclers, as we said. They're decomposers. They break down dead and decaying material and recycle that back into the soil where it's absorbed back in, those nutrients, which are then used to, of course, grow new plants. They're beneficial in the production of medications. Penicillin was derived from the penicillium fungus by Alexander Fleming, and of course very important in the treatment of bacterial infections. Some cause disease, like for example ringworm and athlete's foot fungus. And then others live in types of relationships, what are called symbiotic relationships with other organisms, including the lichen is one, and the relationship between fungi and termites, which you'll be reading about in section 4. The relationship between the lichen is very important, so I wanted to highlight that one a bit more. This is an example of a lichen. You've probably all seen these before on the sides of trees. I have them on my oak trees in my yard on the side that gets the most moisture from the sprinklers. That side is covered with lichen. You probably recognize those. A lichen looks like a pure organism. They're just like one single solitary organism, but it's actually a mutualistic relationship between two organisms in which they both benefit. The lichen is composed of a fungus, as you can see here, and you can see the hypha there. You can see the tube-like structures, and then this green part here is traditionally some type of algae or cyanobacteria. Now, these guys can live in just inhospitable places because they provide each other with what they need. The algae provides some of the food and the nutrients that the fungus needs to survive, and the fungus in return provides support, attachment. It also provides moisture and some of the other additional needs in terms of nutrients that the algae would need. And so together, they actually benefit each other, and they create this incredible organism called the lichen. So that's where we're going to stop for today with this particular part of the unit, and this is as far as the notes will go for the test. Remember, there will be a separate quiz on the plant sections, which we'll be talking about later. Don't forget to look over chapter 21, also the homework assignments, the lab that we did, and I also attached a Kahoot and a couple of videos in the module as well for you to use to review.